Well, welcome to TrineDay's Roundtable 24. Why was JFK murdered on 11/22? And what do the Fitzgeralds have to do with it? A long mystical tale that leads to JFK's vision of world peace. I am Bruce Taurus, moderating. First, Alanna Hartzok will update us on 2024's Real Earth Day event. Alanna is an Earth rights visionary and an expert in the economics of Henry George, among other things. Then writers and journalists Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould will present their Fitzgerald family history, which they have identified as mystical imperialism, and they will describe how it led to the assassination of President Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963. And then we'll have questions and answers with everyone. But first, our host, who has published more than 180 books that challenge official history, Chris Milligan.
Thank you, Bruce, very much. And thank you all, folks, for, spending the time attending. We live in interesting times, and how I see it is we've got quite a few people out there and organizations that have a lot of money that are using that money to try and psychological warfare us into positions that are beneficial to them. Now, psychological warfare comes from the German term meaning worldview warfare. And there's some subsets of that, and one of them is called Zerasdung, and it's basically a psychological warfare method where they attack an individual, and they use different things to pull them out of their natural flow, to cause problems in groups and such like that. And really, that's a lot what we're dealing with here. Okay, now, one thing I wanted to do is to read a bit from a speech by Robert Kennedy. Okay, this is his Day of Affirmation address that he gave at the University of Cape Town exactly 2 years before he died. He gave it on June 6, 1966. This is a day of affirmation, a celebration of liberty. We stand here in the name of freedom. At the heart of Western freedom and democracies is the belief that individual man, the child of God, is a touchstone of value, and all society, all groups and states exist for the person's benefit. Therefore, the enlargement of liberty for individual human beings must be the supreme goal in abiding practice of Western society. The first element of this individual liberty is the freedom of speech, the right to express and communicate ideas, to set oneself apart from the dumb beasts of the field and forest, the right to recall government to their duties and obligations. Above all, the right to affirm one's membership and allegiance to the body politic, to society, to the men whom we share our land, our heritage, and our children's future. Hand in hand with the freedom of speech goes the power to be heard, to share in the decisions of government which shape men's lives, everything that makes men's lives worthwhile: family, work, education, a place to rear one's child, a place to rest one's head. All this depends on the decisions of government. All can be swept away by government, which does not heed the demands of its people, and I mean all of its people. Therefore, the essential humanity of man can be protected and preserved only where the government must answer, not just to the wealthy, not just to those of a particular religion, not just to those of a particular race, but to all of the people. And even government, by the consent of the governed, as in our Constitution, must be limited in its power to act against its people. So there may be no interference with the right to worship, but also no interference with the security of the home, no arbitrary imposition of pains and penalties on an ordinary system by citizens, by officials, high or low, no restrictions on freedom of men to seek education or to seek work or opportunity of any kind, so that each man may become all that he is capable of becoming. Many nations have set forth their own definitions and declarations of these principles. And there have often been wide and tragic gaps between promise and performance, ideals and reality. Yet the ideals have constantly recalled us to our duties. And with painful slowness, we in the United States have extended and enlarged the meaning and the practice of freedom to all of our people. For 2 centuries, my own country has struggled to overcome the self-imposed handicap of prejudice and discrimination based on nationality or social class or race discrimination. Even as my father grew up in Boston, Massachusetts, signs told him that no Irish need apply. 2 generations later, President Kennedy became the first Irish Catholic and the first Catholic to head the nation. But how many men of ability had before 1961 been denied the opportunity to contribute to the nation's progress because they were Catholic or because they were of Irish extraction? How many sons of Italian or Jewish or Polish parents slumbered in the slums, untaught, unlearned, their potential lost forever to our nation and to the human race? Even today, what price will we pay before we assure full opportunity to Negro Americans? So the road towards equality of freedom is not easy, and a great cost and danger march alongside all of us. We are committed to a peaceful and nonviolent change, and that is important for all of us to understand. Though change is unsettling, still, even in the turbulence of protest and struggle, is greater hope for the future as men learn to claim and achieve for themselves the rights formerly petitioned from others. And most important of all the panoply of government power has been committed to the goal of equality before the law, as we now committing ourselves to achieve equal opportunity in fact. We must recognize the full humanity, human equality of all of our people before God, before the law, and in the councils of government. We must do this, not because it is economically advantaged, although it is, not because the laws of God command it, although they do, not because people in other lands wish it so. We must do it for the single and fundamental reason that it is the right thing to do. Our answer is the world's hope. It is to rely on youth. The cruelties and obstacles of this swiftly changing planet will not yield to obsolete dogmas and outworn slogans. It cannot be moved by those who cling to a present which is already dying, who prefer the illusion of security to the excitement and danger which comes with even the most peaceful progress. This world demands the qualities of youth, not a time of life, but a state of mind, a temper of the will, a quality of imagination, a predominance of courage over timidity, of the appetite for adventure over the life of ease. It is a revolutionary world that we live in, and thus, as Mr. Kennedy has said, in Latin America and Asia and in Europe, and in his own country, the United States, it is the young people who must take the lead. Thus, you and your compatriots everywhere have thrust upon you a greater burden of responsibility than any generation that has ever lived. There is, said an Italian philosopher, nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in introduction of a new order of things. Yet this is a measure of the task of our generation, and the road is strewn with many dangers. First is the danger of futility. The belief there is nothing one man or one woman can do against the enormous array of the world's ills, against misery, against ignorance, or injustice and violence. Yet many of the world's great movements of thought and action have flowed from the work of a single man. A young monk began the Protestant Reformation. A young general extended an empire from Macedonia to the borders of the earth. A young woman reclaimed the territory of France. And it was a 32-year-old Thomas Jefferson who proclaimed that all men are equal. Give me a place to stand, said Archimedes, and I will move the world. These men move the world, and so can we all. Few will have the greatness to bend history, but each of us can work to change a small portion of the events. And then that total of all these acts will be written the history of this generation. It is from the numberless diverse acts of courage that the belief in human history is thus shaped. Each time a man stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. And crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring those ripples, build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. Amen.
Right here.
Amen.
Thank you, Chris. And now Alanna.
There are a lot of really big dots that have been connecting Paul and Liz, huge dots for decades, and myself and others in another flow, and now they're connecting, hence the connection of the Henry George economics, the economics of peace. We're bringing forward the original Earth Day, which was the equinox, founded by John McConnell, based on Earth rights, and he was a thoroughgoing Henry George person. Earth rights meaning the rights of the earth to care and protection, and the rights of the human being to the earth. So an Earth rights visionary holds that vision. And so the first time with the Equinox Earth Day, which has been held as a ceremony ringing the peace bell at the United Nations for the past almost every year for 40 years, we are building a worldwide movement for events on March 19th or 20th, Equinox Earth Day events. And we've worked up a mission statement. Ginger Metro did the first work on it, and then Liz and I edited it to its form. That's just one page I'll read, but there's an ask with this. And the ask is that if you like this statement, that you please endorse it, and your name will be added to the endorsement list. You can add your name to the endorsement list through chat today, or there is an email embedded in the document, which you'll receive by email, and you can endorse it that way. So here goes. Economic justice and peace starts by honoring the original Earth Day. Equinox Earth Day, March 2024, mission statement and endorsement request. Greetings. We are an ad hoc group bringing to the fore for 2024 the Earth rights, principles and policies of the original Earth Day, which has been celebrated every year since 1970 on the March equinox. Earth Day founder John McConnell understood that the foundation for an economics and culture of peace can be found in perennial wisdom teachings that tell us how to build stable, peaceful, flourishing societies. He often used the phrase Earth rights to describe these teachings. He also drew much inspiration from the 19th century political economics of Henry George, whose masterwork was Progress and Poverty. Our intention is to build worldwide movements that address wealth inequality, hunger, homelessness, wage slavery, environmental destruction, war, and other major social problems via Earth rights public finance policies, thus removing tax burdens from labor, basic necessities, and needed production, and shifting the tax base to the unearned income from land, natural resources, and other commons. The power to tax is the power to create or destroy. There are many examples of the positive effects of the Earth rights public finance approach, and then you'll receive a link to the Earth rights manifesto in the document. We are encouraging people around the world to focus on the economics and culture of peace by holding gatherings, events, and celebrations on the day of the equinox, which is either the 19th or 20th of March, depending on location, that will bring forth Earth rights, principles, and policies. Note that every year since 1971, the peace bell has been rung at the United Nations at the exact moment of equinox. The ceremony, which has included a minute of silent reflection or prayer, along with music and short speeches, was initiated by the Earth Society Foundation, founded by John McConnell and Margaret Mead. The year 2024 March equinox events will launch movements for Earth rights, principles, and policies that will build an economics and culture of peace. These actions will be coordinated, supported, and guided to maximize effective policy implementation. Our vision is to put in place the fundamentals of an economic system that is fair, regenerative, protective of Earth, and highly decentralized. Please join us. Your first step is to complete the Equinox Earth Day endorsement and event registration form, which there is a link to. We hereby invite you to formally endorse this Equinox Earth Day mission statement by simply writing Equinox Earth Day, yes, please add my name to your endorsement list, and email to equinoxearthday@gmail.com. Or if you like the statement, and I hope you do, just put your name in the chat and I'll add you to it right now. So thank you. Thank you for listening. And this is a great way for us all to keep moving together with this great and grand vision that we're holding and building. So thank you.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alanna.
Thank you.
Liz and Paul.
Okay, well, we've had a very long journey to get to this moment. And what I want to do now is just give you a very quick recap of the journey itself to get to what we will be delivering this afternoon to you. We did start this process in 1991 when we first started gathering the Fitzgerald history going back 1,000 years. And we identified that history ultimately as what we call mystical imperialism. And we believe there's an association that led to the assassination of JFK on November 22nd, 1963. The roundtables that you are now participating in were actually inspired by our desire to resurrect JFK's vision for world peace. It was his American University speech. And that's when we connected with Alanna and the Earth Rights movement. So I want to make sure that people begin to get the back and forth that we've been doing, because we're going to be moving very much into the Fitzgerald history, which it's not obvious when we do that, how it's connected back again to the Earth Rights movement. We hope we'll convince you of it by the end of this statement. JFK was greatly influenced by his grandfather, Boston Mayor John Honey Fitzgerald. He championed, it turned out, the economics of Henry George. And in the early 20th century, he wanted to bring the prosperity and economic justice to Boston. We came to believe that Honey Fitz's embrace of the Earth Rights solutions was creating the foundation of economic justice his grandson would begin to build his vision of world peace on as president. And I think that's the way we want you to think about it. So today, we are going to present a preview of the mystical imperialism history that we will be presenting at the JFK Assassination 60 Years Later conference in Dallas this November 17th. And Paul will present this to you.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you for everybody for being here. I was 12 years old the day JFK was killed, and I remember it as if it were yesterday. I was grief-stricken, but old enough to understand that if someone was willing to execute the President of the United States in broad daylight under the full protection of the United States government and get away with it, what chance did any of us have when the murderers finally decided to turn their guns on us? Over the years, I came to see that there were any number of people willing and capable of doing what happened on November 22nd, 1963. My own bookshelf contains a dozen deeply researched and well-argued books about the subject, many by our publisher, TrineDay. But for me, there was always something missing. And after years, I came to realize it was the perspective. So today I want to present a connection to an older and deeper background story about JFK that puts his assassination into a broader historical context. We set out to research a family history that literally kept reaching out to us and grabbing our attention. And in so doing, found ourselves believing that JFK's Fitzgerald family history was directly connected to the events that played out in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. JFK was shaking up the deep state in ways most people don't understand, and it turns out there was a tradition behind his behavior. Thanks to his maternal grandfather, John Francis Fitzgerald, he had been made aware of his family's roots going back 1,000 years to the foundation of the British Empire, and was most likely informed that old grudges die hard. JFK's declaration that he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds has been on everyone's short list of motives from the beginning. But very few may realize what that phrase would have meant to the people he was threatening to splinter, considering they saw themselves as modern-day Knights Templar tasked with guarding the Holy Grail. It might be hard to believe today that America's elite Cold Warrior spies of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s considered themselves to be holy warriors in a war against evil. But if you look at it through the filter of a black and white Manichaean struggle for power, and that had seesawed back and forth between Rome and London through the centuries, you might get a better idea of how they viewed their mission. Let me start by addressing some assumptions that I came to know simply by growing up as a Fitzgerald in a small suburb north of Boston. Back at that moment in time, I was known to my friends as Fitzy, and that I was unquestionably Irish. As I grew older, I came to know that the Fitz in Fitzgerald was Norman French, but the son of a 12th century Anglo-Norman baron named Gerald of Windsor, and had only been Irish since the year 1169. Gerald and family were what is known as familiaris regis, and that the Fitzgeralds were the product of a Norman Castellan and a princess of Wales named Nest, daughter of the last Welsh king of Duhobarth, Rhys ap Tudor. I also found out that being a Fitzgerald from a little village called Abbeyfield in the southwest corner of Ireland came with a lengthy and complicated history. My grandfather, Michael Fitzgerald, was the oldest son of the oldest son of the oldest son, and inherited a 500-acre farm in Abbeyfield, which he'd left in the hands of his brother Ned before heading for Massachusetts in 1900. By 1912, Michael had worked his way up to being a union official for the Eastern Mass Street Railway Company and got to sit down with Boston Mayor John Francis Honey Fitz Fitzgerald to iron out the difficulties surrounding a serious rail strike. After what I assume was a profound session of solemn prayer at the Parker House bar across the street from City Hall, they proceeded to share backgrounds on their respective Fitzgerald lineages and determined that they were closely related. It seems that there were two main branches of the Fitzgerald family in Ireland, the Earls of Kildare and the Earls of Desmond, both descending from Gerald of Windsor, born in the year 1075, or according to my Y-DNA records, Walter Fitzgerald, his father, whose birth dates to 1025. There are a number of stories as to how those Fitzgeralds got to England in the 11th century, but the one we're going to focus on today is about how they got to Ireland. The record of the Fitzgeralds' arrival in Ireland under the French Angevin king, Henry II, in 1169 is well established and was recorded in a book known as the Expugnatio Hibernica by a famous 12th century prelate named Gerald de Barry. Gerald was the grandson of Gerald of Windsor and the Welsh princess Nest. The Fitzgeralds' relationship through Nest to the Tudor lineage made them contenders to the throne of England. And as a rival Norman family with a Welsh lineage directly connected to the source of Arthurian legends and the Holy Grail, it also made their intentions highly suspect. Gerald of Windsor had already been sent to Ireland in 1102 on a diplomatic mission in a bid to unite Wales and Ireland against the new English king, Henry I. The 12th century was a time of constant power struggles. At the time of the Norman invasion of Ireland, the sovereignty of Scotland, Ireland, and Wales was up for grabs. And an enterprising Norman baron with an extended family of mercenary knights at his disposal could establish a rival kingdom at will and attain sovereignty over it with the Pope's blessing. Such was the case with the Fitzgeralds and their association with the Earl of Pembroke, Richard de Clare, also known as Strongbow. Strongbow was a Welsh marcher lord whose ancestry, like William the Conqueror, went straight back to the Viking Rollo, with close family ties to the Fitzgeralds and strong financial support from London's bankers. Gerald de Barry described the Earl as a quote, high descent, for he was born of the noble stock of Clare, yet withal so far a man whose family was better than his fortune, who had more blue blood than brains, and whose pedigree was longer than his purse. Strongbow would pass on his lineage down through the ages, and in January 2005, a study revealed that among Strongbow's descendants was one George W. Bush, President of the United States. Strongbow's grandfather and great-uncle rode with the hunting party that day in 1100, when King William Rufus was assassinated in the New Forest, and a daughter known as Adeliza was married to the assassin, Walter Tyrrell. The De Clares had gained power and influence under Rufus's successor, Henry I, crusaded in the Holy Land, went to war against Henry II's mother during the anarchy that followed Henry I's death, and operated a serious military-industrial complex on the border of England and Wales, second only in size to the city of London. Strongbow had accepted the invitation of the King of Leinster, Dermot MacMorrough, to help him reclaim his kingdom, and in payment receive his daughter in marriage, as well as the kingship of Leinster upon Dermot's death. While Strongbow was threatening to establish an independent Anglo-Norman state in Ireland, Henry was facing another threat much closer to home. Back in London, his Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, was challenging him over nothing less than his authority over the church. Henry had brought in his old friend Becket as Archbishop to help bring the church to heel, but upon assuming his role as vicar, sided with Rome. "Will no one rid me of this troublesome priest?" Henry was said to proclaim in frustration. The rest is, of course, history, as Becket would soon die in his cathedral from 3 blows to the head delivered by 4 of Henry's knights. The description from the British Museum's website is vivid and brutal. Quote, Becket held tight onto one of the cathedral's pillars to prevent them from seizing him. And it was at this point that one of the knights raised his sword for the first time, bringing it down on Becket, slicing off the crown of his head. 2 of the other knights then started to attack Becket, and most of the monks fled. The 3rd blow brought the archbishop's life to an end. Gruesomely, by the end of the attack, Becket's crown had separated from the head so that blood turned white from the brain, and the brain equally red from the blood. 4 days after Christmas, 1170, 3 blows to the head, the first removing the crown, the 3rd scattering brain matter over consecrated ground. To my mind, Becket's murder sounded too much like JFK, the JFK assassination, to be coincidence. And when I learned that by the ancient rules of Saxon kingship, the archbishop could stand in for the king as the sacred sacrifice in a 7-year astrological cycle, I felt even more so. I'd seen the classic film version of Becket in 1964, but it took me years to see the connection. But coming off Afghanistan 20 years later, where I'd witnessed the official narrative being fabricated for events that had been intentionally made to happen, Becket now looked different. Still, an 800-year-old murder was just ancient history with no personal meaning to me until we came upon 2 books that changed our outlook forever. The first, titled Strongbow's Conquest of Ireland, had been compiled in London in 1888 as one in a series of popular histories of Britain. It included much of Gerald de Barry's Expugnatio Hibernica, but also chronicles from the Irish perspective that opened my mind to the way people in the 12th century thought about the world. Reading it for the first time was like reading Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, with dreams, visions, phantom armies, prophecies, and miracles filling the pages. But Strongbow's conquest wasn't fiction, it was history. And when I turned to Appendix 2 on page 195 and viewed the names of the invaders, it was no longer history, it was personal. There in black and white was a list of the most prominent persons engaged in the conquest of Ireland, made under Henry II, and the first 7 of them could have been pallbearers at my father's funeral, including my father's name, William Fitzgerald, and my great-grandmother's maiden name, Barry. Much in Strongbow's conquest regarded the personalities of the Fitzgerald family and their fulfillment of Merlin's prophecy. Prophecies were important to 12th century ecclesiastical authors who saw them as a way to justify the invasion as God's will. Gerald de Barry himself promised a full book of such prophecies and applied one of them from Merlin Sylvester to the ritual murder of Thomas Becket 4 days after Christmas, 1170. Quote, a new martyr will be revealed by a new kind of miracle. In Western lands and in the age when the world is drawing to its end, he will, by his own peculiar power, restore to the maimed and wretched limbs that have been wrenched out or cut off. And again, grief will be transformed to joy when sons butcher their father in their mother's womb. The West will enjoy what was formerly the prerogative of the East, and at the setting sun, while its lights seem to be quenched and extinguished, the daylight illumines with a new brightness the mists of the Western land and of the closing age of the world. To Gerald de Barry, Thomas Becket represented the father in the highest degree of the Grail ritual, as we know, as was known to the Welsh in 1170, while the mother's womb represented the mother church in which he was killed. To him, the 4 knights represented the sons, sentenced by the Pope himself to spend the remainder of their lives fighting in the Holy Land with the Knights Templar and buried at the end of their days at the steps of the Temple of Jerusalem. Restore the maimed and wretched limbs that have been cut off and sons butchering their father in their mother's womb sounded to me a lot like Isis and Osiris and a Hermetic ritual sacrifice intended to restore fertility to the land by killing the sacred king. The second book we found had been published in 1947 by author U. Ross Williamson with the title The Arrow and the Sword, an essay in detection. The arrow being the instrument for the death of King William Rufus, William the Conqueror's son, and the sword being the instrument of Thomas Becket's death. As an author of British history and a parish priest in the ministry of the Church of England, Williamson's research had led him to believe that the deaths of Rufus in 1100 and Thomas Becket in 1170 were ritual deaths, and that those rituals were conducted by medieval Gnostic cults. As it stood in 1964, Becket was very well-known history. The saga represented the primal Western struggle between church and state, and that struggle had continued into the modern era. I knew from my own 3 years hosting a public affairs talk show at the Christian Broadcasting Network in the late 1970s that the issue had never gone away, and JFK had confronted it head-on during the 1960 presidential campaign in an address to the Greater Houston Ministerial Association. Was his allegiance to Rome an obstacle to his being president? JFK's grandfather, John Francis Fitzgerald, had faced it in old Brahmin Boston, and 60 years later, JFK was facing it in Texas. But to add an ancient pagan conspiracy to the death of the legendary Thomas Becket, simultaneous with the Fitzgeralds arriving in Ireland, was a coincidence too big to ignore. And I began to see the outlines of something I'd been bumping into all my life. Williamson had done an excellent job at laying out the evolution of the cult, the tradition behind the sacred kingship, the blood sacrifice, the human victim, the pattern and myths and conspiracy of silence that protected it. He'd cited the same account by John of Salisbury used at the British Museum's website, but where the British Museum glosses over the conflicting details in Salisbury's original eyewitness account, Williamson sees a cover-up by someone who was his closest friend and counselor. He writes, quote, his account is a masterpiece of omissions and falsifications. It is to him that we owe the deliberate lie which found its way into books and pictures that Becket died in front of the altar. He, Salisbury, is careful to insist that Becket fell with body straight, whereas the other accounts make it clear he was careful to fall to the right, that is to say, towards the north, or as Garnier's poem put it, quote, in the Isle of the North, facing the north, did Thomas suffer death. His omissions are not less pointed than his falsifications, end quote. As a second indication that the murder was a cult rite and that everyone involved was a part of it, Williamson cites the words attributed to one of the knights. He wished to be the king. He wished to be more than the king. Just let him be the king. But it is in the direction of Becket's death to the north that he sees an indisputable effort to conceal the truth. Williamson continues, quote, it is probable that those with knowledge of Masonic secrets are in a position to estimate, even if they could not divulge, the full meaning of this, but at least it can be seen and said that in all dualist philosophy and explicitly Manichaeanism, that North and South have distinct and opposed significations. According to Mani, one of the expressions of two forces of good and evil were the two trees, the tree of life in the north and the tree of death in the south. Becket took his stand deliberately by the great central pillar in the north transept. This was the place where, according to a member of his household, quote, he had long ago beheld himself crucified in a dream. Whatever his motive for, quote, turning aside to the northern part of the church and choosing a pillar rather than an altar for the place of his death, his action led him to die where ritually the divine victim might have been expected to die. End quote. I didn't need knowledge of Masonic secrets in order to make an analogy with the JFK assassination. Given that Dealey Plaza was an outdoor Masonic temple dedicated to Isis and Osiris, the site of the first Masonic lodge in Dallas, and that its namesake was a 33rd degree Scottish Rite Mason and Knight Templar, should have been enough. But the fact that the procession should immediately turn to the north following the execution spoke to the same ritual ceremony that had brought down Becket. And thanks to Williamson's in-depth study, we also learned that the ceremony centered on the Arthurian Grail mythology rooted in Welsh history, and that the origin of that history stretched back in time to the Roman occupation of Britain and the secret Gnostic religion their soldiers practiced, known as Mithraism. If you asked anyone today who wasn't an English major in the 1960s about the Holy Grail, they'd probably cite the fictional attempt to decipher the secret known as the Da Vinci Code. But when U. Ross Williamson narrowed the source of the mythology of the Holy Grail down to the 12th century Welsh court of Pembrokeshire, I knew I was getting to where the mythology and the reality merged, and where the Fitzgerald family merged with that reality. Williamson writes, quote, Dr. J.L. Weston has established that the original stories, which developed into the Arthurian romance, those of Percival and Gawain, had their rise in precisely those regions where Mithraic remains are known to exist. She has identified the original author, Blaharis, with Bledry, son of Cadivor, who entertained William the Conqueror on his visit to Wales and who died in that year William Rufus ascended to the throne. Her contention is that the Grail story is not a product of imagination, but the record of an ancient ritual, having for its ultimate object the initiation of the sources of life, physical and spiritual. So the Grail did have a basis in reality, but the underlying reality was pagan, and the Fitzgeralds were living in the middle of its transition to Christianity. And as warrior knights with a large measure of autonomy, spending most of their time either at war or waiting for someone to make war on them, they were most likely practicing it. As Williamson explains, quote, when the struggle between Mithraism and Christianity ended in the definite triumph of the latter, the higher ritual still survived and was celebrated in sites removed from the centers of population. The ritual of gaining the Grail was a nature ritual intended to initiate the Son of Man into a true spiritual life, grade by grade through ritual trial and error of war until he ascended to the role of father and was given the crown of Mithra. So who were the individuals responsible for carrying these rituals into the modern era? And why was the date of November 22nd so important? I learned from my research into the inner workings of the 19th century British involvement in Afghanistan that Masonic symbols and numerology had always played a covert role in the messaging. Masonry and British intelligence in Afghanistan were one and the same. When British military historian John Keegan visited CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia in the 1980s, what impressed him the most was its resemblance to the British India's political and secret service in the days of the Raj. Quote, it has assumed the mantle once worn by Kim's masters, as if it were a seamless garment, he wrote. The foundation of Kipling's Masonic lore and its connection to the Knights Templar rested on a work published in 1840 by Grand Master of Scottish Freemasonry in India and Grand Preceptor in the Order of the Knights Templar, James Burns. James was the brother of legendary British spy, military officer, and diplomat Alexander Burns, who was murdered in Kabul in 1841, and one of the models for the man who would be king. During World War II, the Office of Strategic Services inherited Burns's legacy, and its director, Wild Bill Donovan, referred to his agents as Knights Templar, in memory of the sacred role they played as crusaders in the defense of Jerusalem. Then as now, the CIA saw itself through the lens passed down from that same British intelligence that once used secret Masonic messaging, and the date November 22nd was the biggest message of all. As we discovered in over 40 years of research into the 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, once the approved narrative is established, the gatekeepers will use it to serve their purposes, no matter what evidence might emerge to contradict it. We gained our knowledge of the narrative machine at CBS News, where we witnessed Muslim extremists being transformed into a vehicle to deliver revenge and retribution for America's humiliation in Vietnam. By no lack of coincidence, Dan Rather had played a pivotal role in establishing the lone gunman theory by misreporting the Zapruder film on November 25th, 1963. And according to a 1981 Columbia Journalism report, Rather provided the same service for the CIA on April 6, 1980, in a 60 Minutes report by, quote, consolidating popular misconceptions about the Afghan war into one high-impact coast-to-coast broadcast, end quote. Giving the Russians their own Vietnam and Afghanistan had been kicking around the CIA for years. The CIA's Chuck Cogan, the man who ran the Afghan operation, boasted to us on camera that Afghanistan was always about getting revenge on Russia for Vietnam. But with the help of Dan Rather, the idea of a crusade to prevent the evil empire from seizing the Holy Land would take hold until the Soviets withdrew. As we watched, America fell under the spell of Rudyard Kipling, Alexander Burns, and the 19th century British Empire. We were shocked that our government would abandon strategic arms limitation and detente with the Soviets by empowering medieval religious extremists. But as we got to know the rules of the game, we came to realize a legacy of the British Empire played a larger role in modern geopolitical decisions than we had ever imagined. On October 13th, 1307, the French king ordered the powerful Catholic military order known as the Knights Templar arrested and charged with heretical practices. And a month later, on November 22nd, under pressure from the king, the Pope instructed all the monarchs of Europe to seize the Templars' extensive assets. Following an extensive inquisition and trial, including torture, the Templars and their Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, were found guilty and on March 18, 1314, burned at the stake. The immolation of Templar Grand Master Jacques de Molay at the hands of the Pope's inquisitors would serve as an inspiration for generations to seek revenge on the Roman Church. And so begins the legend that winds its way from Jerusalem to Paris, to the Holy Grail, to Rosslyn Chapel and Scottish Rite Freemasonry, and from there to the death of JFK. Much has been speculated about the survival of the Templars following their dissolution in 1312. Today's romantic fiction about their role as guardians of the Holy Grail rests mainly on Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe and James Burns' sketch of the Knights Templar. Burns had placed both the Fitzgerald and Kennedy coats of arms in his list of chevaliers at the beginning of the book. It was Burns' detailed inclusions of Strongbow and the role of the Fitzgeralds as loyal Irish Templars that I found intriguing. One of them being Maurice, Lord of Kerry, who served in 1309 as the last Grand Prior of the Order in Ireland. Burns had gone out of his way to establish a connection to Masonry between the ancient Hermetic symbols and traditions he'd uncovered in Afghanistan, and in 1837 was sent by the Grand Master of England to inform the Fitzgerald Duke of Leinster, Grand Master of Ireland, all about it. A 2017 book by British Ambassador Craig Murray about the First Anglo-Afghan War, Alexander Burns, Master of the Great Game, not only connects Afghanistan to the Grail legend, but maintains that the legendary Burns and his brother James are the source of the Templar connection to Scottish Freemasonry, and that they invented it. But after dealing directly with Afghanistan's legacy of Alexander the Great, and as a crossroads of ancient mystery religions, I'm not convinced the connection can be ruled out. There are many aspects of the old religion and the Knights Templar involving the so-called high-grade rituals that remain unexplained, and especially when it comes to the Masonic 30th degree of revenge and retribution. A book published in 1926 under the title Glimpses of Masonic History by Charles Webster Leadbeater states that, quote, the Pope abolished the order in private consistory on November 22nd, 1312, a date still commemorated in striking fashion in our high-grade rituals, although he admitted that the charges were not proved. The riches of the temple were to be transferred to the order of St. John the Hospitallers. And so there it was. a straight line from the destruction of the Templars to the creation of the Scottish Rite Freemasonry and the date November 22nd. Leadbeater continues, quote, traditions of vengeance upon the execrable king and pope and the traitor passed down throughout the ages and were interwoven with the Egyptian tradition corresponding to our Black Masonry, culminating in what we now call the 30th degree. It is these traditions of vengeance, however little understood from their basis of our 30th degree ritual. End of quote. The Fitzgeralds' presence in Ireland had gotten off to a bad start with Henry II. When his governor first arrived in Ireland, he spoke to his own followers, saying, I will soon put an end to this arrogance and disperse those shields. Over the next 400 years, relations wavered back and forth as the power and influence of Kildare and Desmond grew. For over 2 centuries, the Fitzgeralds of Desmond acted as Irish kings. But with the onset of the Reformation in 1517, they found themselves siding with the Pope and in the middle of a new challenge. In 1534, the English Parliament's Act of Supremacy declared Henry VIII supreme head on earth of the Church of England, which meant that the Pope no longer held religious authority in England over Ireland. James XIII, Earl of Desmond, didn't see it that way, and so began the slow, grinding holy war that would pit the Fitzgeralds in a fight to the death against London. In 1541, Henry VIII proposed that James's son, Gerald, be raised at the English court as a companion to his son, Prince Edward, who would later become Edward VI of England. James rejected the offer and nothing came of it. But a few years later, when word got out that James had entered into covert negotiations with Pope Paul III to establish the sovereignty of Munster, he was labeled the traitor Earl, and the mark would stick. By the time James's son Gerald assumed the title as the 14th Earl, a deep suspicion had developed, and by the time of the coronation of Queen Elizabeth I in 1558, had evolved into an open rejection of English rule. In 1568, the First Desmond Rebellion broke out. Elizabeth took the opportunity to send Gerald and his brother John to the Tower, and Gerald would spend much of the next 10 years imprisoned there. In a clear escalation, on February 25th, 1570, Pope Pius V issued the bull Regnans in Excelsis, which declared the Elizabethan excommunicated from the Roman Catholic Church and deprived her of sovereignty in England and Ireland. In addition to excommunication, the bull released the Queen's subjects from any loyalty they owed her and ordered them not to obey her laws or commandments under penalty of excommunication. In what amounted to an act of war, the Pope had made every English Catholic a potential traitor to the kingdom. In an effort to calm the tensions, Gerald would write a final appeal to Elizabeth from his castle in Abbeyfield, pleading for peace, but it was too little, too late. In the end, the Fitzgeralds' war against the Elizabethans and their cult of Renaissance and Neoplatonism was more than just a local insurrection, but a cosmic struggle. As allegorized in Edmund Spenser's Fairy Queen, the Fitzgeralds satisfied the Manichaean requirement for evil in the English propaganda of the day, while Elizabeth and her Red Cross Templar Knights represented Christian purity in the tradition of King Arthur and the Roundtable. The tradition would be instilled into Queen Elizabeth's anti-papist intelligence services, operated by a cabal of Neoplatonists known as the Sydney Circle, and remained there as a foundation principle of British intelligence as the empire grew. It is of no small importance that the beheading of Gerald Fitzgerald, the last Earl of Desmond, in 1583 marked the beginning of the British Empire. The eternal struggle of good against evil, the ancient Manichaean war of light against dark, required a victory over the darkness, and the Earl of Desmond filled that sacred role. His decapitated head was sent to London, where legend has it, Queen Elizabeth sat with it for the morning before having it impaled on London Bridge. The royal hatred for Desmond Fitzgeralds and the celebration of their extinction was recorded as history in the 1586 edition of Holinshed's Chronicles with a dedication to Sir Walter Raleigh by the author John Hooker. Hooker labels the destruction of the Desmond Earl as, quote, one of the great and wonderful works of God, both his severe judgment against traitors, rebels, and disobedient, and of his mercy and loving kindness upon the obedient and the dutiful. But of all others, none to be compared to this tragical discourse of Ireland and the most unnatural wars of the Desmond, that brain-sick and breakdance Gerald of Desmond and his brethren, allies, and complices, forgetting the honor of his house and forsaking their faith, did break into treasons and showed themselves open enemies, traitors, and rebels, using all manner of hostilities and outrages to impeach of her most sacred majesty, and the destruction of the Commonwealth, the price whereof, in the end, he paid with his and their own bloods, to the utter destruction of themselves and that whole family. With Queen Elizabeth's incorporation of the British East India Company in 1600, Elizabeth's victory would be spread around the world. Her favorite courtier, Walter Raleigh, would sail to America and establish the colony that came to be named Virginia for the Virgin Queen. The empire created by Elizabeth's courtiers ruled much of the earth for 4 centuries and was passed on to the United States. But the eternal struggle of good against evil, of the war of light against dark continues. And whether real or imagined, the need to avenge the Templar sacrifice lingers on. Gerald de Barry considered Thomas Becket's 12th century martyrdom to be the fulfillment of a prophecy written by the Merlin Sylvester in the 6th century. For our ending today, we will update that prophecy and have chosen to name John Fitzgerald Kennedy as the martyr that has already fulfilled it. We have titled it Transforming Revenge and Retribution into the Resurrection of JFK and the USA. Quote, JFK is the martyr, the slain son revealed by our new kind of miracle in Western lands and in the age when the world is drawing to its end, who will by his own peculiar power restore to the maimed and wretched limbs that have been wrenched out or cut off. And again, grief will transform into joy when sons recognize their ability to bring peace to the world, and by doing so, will heal the father's wound and the need for endless war. The West will enjoy what was formerly the prerogative of the East, and at the setting of the sun, while the sun rises in its setting, while its light seems to be quenched and extinguished, the daylight illumines with a new brightness the mists of the Western land and of the closing age of the world. Orators will come from the East, and princes and principal men will worship the footsteps of a new martyr in the lands that lie on the western borders of the ocean. The last Earl of Desmond was slain in 1583 while fighting to the bitter end for the Irish people. Even with that devastating blow to the cause of Irish freedom, the affection for the Fitzgerald family continued to grow. As the President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy rose to the level of his great ancestor and won the affection of the American people. When he was killed, his dream for peace was killed as well. If we who believe in this vision can come together, we can resurrect JFK's dream for America and restore the hope to the world that was lost with his death. In 1926, a folklorist recorded among the peasants of Kerry a curious belief. If on a dark night in November, in the glen below Low Gur, the birthplace of the magical Earl Geroid Iarla, a peasant should be given the sight, he will see a company of silver horsemen risen from the lake and galloping through the night. At their head rides the great Earl Gerald himself, garbed in silver brocade and astride a mighty white horse. The Earl will laugh and throw him a gorgeous purse, in which will be found 1,000 silver pieces, the price paid for his head, and when the vision is gone, the money will remain. It is clear by today's attendance that the Earl and his phantom soldiers have already been stirred from their slumber and will rise from Low Gur to help JFK's spirit return to the American people at our time of greatest need. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow.
Quite a bit to unpack in there, hey?
Oh, it's a deal. It's a deal. But a good deal.
Yes, yes, yes.
So
We invite everyone to unmute and raise your hand, say you have a question. Try to keep your comments in the form of a question so we can allow time for everyone to participate. And Joanne Winchester, I saw you first.
Thank you. The Winchester family apparently owned the Fifth of England as farmers and estate developers at one point, I've been told. What I want to say, and then there's a whole nother Tudor lineage and Welsh lineage that I think weaves into all of this in some way. It reminds me, listening to this extraordinary briefing you just gave us, of the story of Isis, on whom I believe the Statue of Liberty is based. That's just a little, iconic
Mhm.
weaving
Yeah.
of who we are as America and
Who we
the
are, yeah.
prophecies that we would be the evolutionary and genetic transformation of the human species as the polar shift scenario accelerates.
Paul and Liz, any resonance with what Joanne just shared?
Yeah, there's no question. I mean, we have these, the thing is that what we discovered is that we have many of these symbols, these iconic symbols, embroidered into our fabric as Americans and as humans and in our past as well. I mean, we all share the kind of expressions that, that I just read to you. The fact is that everyone in their families have gone through these kinds of things. That we were just fortunate at the fact that the Fitzgeralds happened to be in a position where it was written down about them.
Right.
And they actually happened to come into conflict and contact with some of the most famous figures of history during that time period. So, and the fact is that, my grandfather's farm sat plunk right in the middle of this whole place. And there's a castle to this day that belonged to the Earl of Desmond, the last Earl of Desmond, that sits about a quarter of a mile down the road from where my grandfather's farm they're still there. Fitzgerald family is still there. Ned's family wound up taking it over and have operated it successfully since he left in 1900. So, I really think it's very exciting and fulfilling at this time in our life, in the history of our country and the history of our planet, to be able to go back and find the roots that we come connected to and how important they were. And the fact that, whatever evil was done or bad was done, the fact is that the goodness that was done by all the other people, certainly during the last 1,000 years, is what we really ought to be focusing on, not the acts of a few, maniacal individuals whose grasp for power was just insatiable. It's my opinion.
The piece you read, will you be publishing that somewhere?
Well, not before it's presented.
We're going to be delivering that in Dallas
Right.
on the
Well,
17th
yeah.
of November. So we will be publishing it after that.
Yeah.
Man, I can't wait to go through it sentence by sentence.
We will
Alanna,
be doing that
hello.
shortly.
Yeah,
Hi,
yeah.
really quickly. What if Desmond had won instead of ended up his head on the platter of Queen Elizabeth I? Just to play with this reverse history, because you're presenting like the dark forces won and the Fitzgerald lost, and now all these but
Yep.
but now you're saying now we're going to win. The light forces are going to win with JFK and the peace speech. What if it had been? What would have happened if Fitzgerald, the Desmond had won that battle?
Hey,
All
tell
right.
'em.
Okay, all right. What wouldn't have happened is that the Fitzgeralds would not have fulfilled the final stage of their transformation. They were, for 400 years, they became married to the land of Ireland and to the Irish people, but they still came from an elite world, and they were still very much connected to it. And that was all part of the dying process. They had to die in order to literally be reborn for the next 400 years. So that's part of a reality. You can't wish this kind of quality out of your system. You really have to have an authentic process. And so in the dying, when Gerald, and remember, the idea is really not about dying being a problem. It's about what you die for. Gerald died, and all the other Geroidi Jarlas died for the people of Ireland. That was the point. But this process now, in its final stage, in the return of the power of what was represented by their death, in fact, I would say that the Hooker translation that you just heard, where they completely condemned the Fitzgeralds for being treasonous and traitorous and all of that.
Forever. Yeah.
Ultimately, what their crime was that they chose the people over the elites. That was their crime. And that is the worst crime of all to the elites, to actually lose one of their own. And that was all part of it. They were in that world. So that's what I would say to you, Alanna, is that it is not at all that that they couldn't have fulfilled the actual role we need now if they had become kings of Ireland. Okay, someone else would have to do
They
it.
wouldn't have become the authentic
Yes,
heirs of
some-
this
yeah.
process.
Someone else would have had to have risen out of Lake Logur to fulfill it.
Thank you. Alanna, you good with that?
I'm really trying to feel into the story when you say they stood with the people of Ireland, but yet they weren't pure enough, or they would have become kings and become dominators. Nevertheless, how if they stood with the people of Ireland, well, they were just trying to fight back the rule of Elizabeth and the conquering and control of Ireland by the Elizabethans. So they were trying to me, it's sort of like two monarchs fighting. I'm trying to see what this stood with the people mean.
Well, what's interesting, I mean, a very good guy wrote a book about it about, what, 30 years ago, called The Twilight Lords. And he gives a very detailed, and we met the Knight of Glyn, who was also known as the Black Knight, Desmond Fitzgerald. And this was back in 1997. And he said, I had already read the book, and he said, you really got to read this book called The Twilight Lords, because it really sums it up. And the fact is that he really did kind of get the gist of the emotional feeling that was going on, and this Renaissance Neoplatonism, Giordano Bruno, and the whole influence of what was going on. Giordano Bruno, this kind of arch heretic who wound up getting burnt at the stake, actually was a spy for the Elizabethans. He actually was acting. He was turning in Catholics who were plotting to overthrow the Reformation and plotting to overthrow Elizabeth. So he clearly this process of Renaissance Neoplatonism with the Sydney Circle and Walter Raleigh and all of these guys. I mean, they really were. They're kind of like, this kind of background elite, high-level people who really consider. He even remarks about the fact that they really reviled the Irish people because they lived in the earth. They lived with the earth. And they really were disgusted by them. And they said at the same time, they would put out all of these wonderful poems about the beauty of nature and the beauty of living with nature, and how the reformed human spirit would have to become living in this idyllic society. And he points out the irony. This guy Burleth points out the irony, saying, they had it in Ireland.
They already had
They had it
paradise.
right in front of them.
They had paradise.
But their ideal was just, high-mindedness.
Right. And the Fitzgeralds
Yeah.
actually preferred to be connected to the real Irish people. That's the point. So they were literally learning. They were going through a learning process. And it was not that they necessarily would have become the same kind of rulers if they become the kings of Ireland, but there's a level of the complete shedding of this power, okay, that the elites bring with them. There is an assumption of authority and an assumption over humans. You can see it in the Anunnaki tablets. You can see this evolution in thinking. So the idea that how do you become with the people where you no longer can even be tempted? It's not possible anymore. And I think that if you have to choose, and that's the point about the Fitzgeralds clearly chose to die with the people, but in choosing that, and again, I'd make the point, you're going to die anyway. What are you dying for? So when JFK accepted his fate as president by taking on the role of president, he absolutely accepted his fate that he could be killed. Whether he consciously thought about it all the time or not, there's no question. It's well documented in history that presidents can be assassinated, and he certainly brought with him a lot of angst again, between the Brahmins who ran this country, and obviously between especially the Fitzgerald Irish as opposed to just any Irish. So when you combine that together, And what would give him the ability to have been able to confront that and absolutely be clear what he had to do and how he had to do it? And
That's a great point.
I just feel it had to have come from that complete surrender, you might say. It's like there was a surrender of that old world connection, that old, ancient connection that the Fitzgeralds had become connected to.
The Church of England, okay, when Henry VIII set up the Church of England, it really wasn't part of the Protestant Reformation. It was a power grab. Okay, I mean, and you had a Christianity, you had a Celtic Christianity that was very strong in Ireland and in rural England that preceded Roman Catholicism there.
Right.
So, I mean, it's a little bit more nuanced than some of it, but like I say, the Church of England wasn't really part of the Protestant Reformation. It was a power grab by the king.
Well, the Fitzgerald family did call upon the papal authority to do it. The papal nuncio actually got the Pope to invoke the just war doctrine of the Catholic Church in order to help the Desmond Fitzgeralds fight the Elizabethans. So,
yeah.
So
They were in a pitched battle.
It is nuanced, but that was what created the tension between the two regimes.
Ready for a new question?
Absolutely.
Ruth, I see your hand patiently waiting.
I have heard this many times, and I'm still trying to digest it. But one of the things that I'm really thinking about is the power of stories and how Paul is talking about his family lineage, and he has a history that he has been able to look at to see the evolution of these ancient, Isis, Osiris myths, that have come through time, but that we all are playing out these stories within ourselves. And there's something about, this is what I keep pondering. It's like, up till now, we've been caught in revenge and retribution stories and stories that are about power over, and there's something about the coming of consciousness of this in individuals that I think is potent. And I just throw that out because I feel that in the awakening, or throwing a light on the fact that this part of our consciousness is being brought to us to look at, that we can create something different.
I absolutely, I mean, I think that the power, I think that we are trying to bring to people is understanding that every one of us has the exact same kind of lineage within ourselves, and we have to begin to accept the power of that, even if you can't literally trace it back. And I think that's the whole point of the Fitzgerald legacy, that it's a way to understand this battle within this, the bloodlines, the royal bloodlines themselves. And we're still living in that battle. And we're trying to tell them, it's over, folks. We really can't keep doing this. And we have to have I think, an understanding of how to approach that issue with them, approach that problem with them, and really calm them down and say, no, it's over. We really are going to make this change. Then we can think about, Ruth, then anything's possible then. Anything's
Amen.
possible.
Amen.
I-
Wendell?
I just want to say one more thing. I also have for myself such a deep sense of my own history, having been taken away from me by the disruption of so much violence that has been, encoded in history. And I know this history lives inside of me, and I feel like the investigation is helping me understand that it does live inside of me, even though it hasn't been written down.
Absolutely, yeah. Me too.
Wendell?
Hi, at least three things, maybe more. So we don't have to discuss them all. First of all, Henry George was of Welsh descent. So there's a connection there in some way. Not exactly sure what that means, but you know, Henry George Cambrensis like that.
Yeah.
I wonder if the second head that apparently Elizabeth held on her lap during her reign was Mary Queen of Scots
Yeah.
head. And I'm wondering if there's any connection there. If we can talk about it some other time, but do you know anything, any connection with,
Well, you know, I mean, they
with the
tried.
Fitzgerald story?
They even tried, I mean, to marry off Queen Elizabeth to Gerald at one point in his life, because he was a young, you know, prospering guy with this big part of Ireland under his feet, and was going to inherit this kingdom. And so there was a lot of subtle, you know, as Chris pointed out, there was very nuanced negotiations between various family members, and you know, they were going through a very turbulent time period, the modernization process, the Renaissance, all these new ideas that were coming forward, the papal authority. You could still declare, you could still operate a country and declare, ask the Pope for the purposes, you know, to get sovereignty and get it. So that was really a big issue during that time period. And so the Fitzgeralds, when Strongbow and the Fitzgeralds went to Ireland, they were completely in a position to basically become the kings of Ireland.
Right.
They had to get the permission of the Pope to say, okay, well, we'll bow down to you and the Pope, and you know, the heck with Henry II. So, you know, that was all very possible. It was very real. It was very fluid, you know, and a lot of this stuff still happens, but it happens behind the scenes, and it happens between banks, and it happens, you know, and that sort of thing. But the fact is that these kind of power struggles are, you know, are very real. And so, you know, the world that we know isn't completely, you know, as it is. It's just, we have the image of a history and a very simplified, you know, evolution of eras, but it doesn't really work that way.
I just had one during your presentation, Paul. You mentioned, I guess, the Earls of Kildare, and I'm a little confused. The Earls of Desmond and Kildare, were the Kildares connected with all of this?
Yeah, interestingly enough, they were. They kind of were bucked by England first. They suffered the crushing blow before the Desmond Fitzgeralds did. You had two separate earldoms, okay? The Desmond branch was considered a cadet branch of Kildare, but they were considered to be two separate earldoms. And so when that 1325 or something like that was when they were established. So the Earls of Kildare are still extant. They're still there. Okay, the Duke of Leinster is the Earl of Kildare. That's something that they have a lot of the different names for the same thing. So that when James Burns was ordered to go to Ireland to brief the Duke of Leinster, he was briefing the Kildare branch of the family about this connection to Afghanistan. So, and the Knights Templar and the Masonic symbols. I'm sure everyone here has seen The Man Who Would Be King, but that's a big part of the ritual ceremony. He would be the king. He would be more than the king. Let him be the king, is what they said about Becket. Okay, he was the stand-in for Henry II. So yes.
Well, I think the other point I want to quickly make is that there were Fitzgeralds who did side with London. Okay, not all Fitzgeralds separated. So that's all part of the reality we're living with today. And, you know, is that split within the Fitzgeralds themselves.
How human.
We had an article published by the Irish Times. And it was a review of our book 10 years ago, and they gave me a capital G.
That means you're part of,
Yeah,
London.
say whether you want to be or not, you're part of the deal here, pal.
Yeah.
You get the capital G. So I just thought it was funny at the time.
I want to ask Paul and Liz, the times we're living in now, post 1963, the narrative you read positions us as spectators until we want to participate in the transformation of grief into joy. And so much of what we recently just discussed how this is mirrored internally for each of us in our personal lives, I see the challenge as one of maturity. You know, even the wars going on today, children fight eye for an eye. He hit me, so I have to hit him until there's nobody left. And it's a function of maturity to say, all right, how do we transcend this? How do we forgive? On what terms can we stop fighting and can we forgive? And after what are your thoughts, Paul and Liz, about that? And then Ruth, I see you as the next question. But Paul and Liz, is there anything into that you can share?
Well, I heard a story today that I think is very, very perfect for addressing your question, because it also connects to what is going on today in Gaza. Okay, and this is a story told by an Israeli historian, and he was going back and describing what Palestine was like before Israel was created. And he said it basically, there was a very strong relationship between the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims. They were all coexisting without any major difficulties at all. And his question that he was raising is, what might have happened? What was possible? I think that, by the way, aligns with your point, Alanna, too. When you see something like that, okay, but the times were not set for that to happen. I mean, he tells the whole story and it's unbelievable. But to hear that, I mean, I just didn't know that there was this recognized coexistence in Palestine that was working quite well. Okay, and so I think that's what we're looking at. And it does make you ask questions. Why did that have to happen? Why did that have to be completely destroyed and to, end up with the mess we're in today, obviously, in Israel with Gaza. But I think that would apply, to what we're describing in Ireland, where this was actually a perfect, beautiful environment. That was what Berleth was talking about in Ireland. And that could not be almost tolerated by the leaders of our world. And that's what we're living through, is finally being able to reclaim, back and say, wait a minute, folks, we have a different idea now. We are mature. Maybe that's the point. The people now are mature enough to step forward and say, I'm taking back my authority that I gave you at some point in the past. I'm going to take it back. And they may say, oh, you can't do that. And I say, oh, yes, I can.
That's the thrill of these roundtables. It's the thrill of what Chris Milligan always emphasizes, that the internet and the personal computer are allowing us to chase lies and catch up to them almost in real time. That's my phraseology of it. And it couldn't be more urgent. And Ruth, I invite you to share.
Just have this thought in my head, because I'd always thought about England being the continuation of the virus of empire from Rome, from the Roman Empire. And I just wanted to make a connection between what England held in relationship to the Irish and this feeling I had about the conquest that Rome made all throughout, the lands that it conquered, and that impulse that I feel like wound up in the Roman Church and also in England. And it just throw that out.
Well, this Mithraic aspect of it, Mithra is the dark side of Jesus Christ. He's his other. And
he's the warrior.
He's the warrior.
Mithraism older than that.
I'm sorry?
Mithraism is older than that.
Well, it's older than Christianity, but
Yes.
the fact is that was there was a struggle in Rome between the Mithraism and between Christianity. And the Mithraism lost out and went underground, so to speak. And and that's where the temple, ironically, literally, Mithra was worshipped underground. His temples were in caves and in secret places, but spread all over Europe. They found, there was a Mithraic temple in London. It was the religion of the soldiers' religion, and it came from the Near East. So it's very ancient. It's very old. Mithra was the mediator between the sun and man. Okay, he was the guy between God and man that settled the differences between the two and enabled him to converse with God. So that's why that's where your Holy Grail comes from. Your seven grades. Williamson goes through the 7 grades of the ritual of the Holy Grail in order to become the father at the 7th level. That was the degree, the 7th degree.
Did Mithraism collapse into Masonry?
There are aspects of the rituals that were held over into Masonry. Yes, exactly. And that's what, I mean, you had people who were fighting, and picking up the descendants of the legionnaire idea, the Roman legionnaires, and what they were doing in terms of putting their practices and their secret societies into the religious practices of the day.
But
And
Chris,
the
you
fact
kind of shook your head no at that question about Mithraism and Masonry.
Well, Masonry really has to do with the Knights Templar, and the Knights Templar, there's a book called Rex Do, and it tells the story of the people around the temple. I mean, the temple in Jerusalem, it was for the priest and for the royals, okay? But then you had a whole cadre of people around there because you had to have many ritualized objects for the temple, say cassia and herb, okay? And to make the ritually prepared and ritually grown herb for the temple, it took a family to do that. So you had these multiple families around the temple. And Rex Do tells a story of them leaving the temple around 70 AD, going up through the Levant and through Turkey and into the Champagne area of France. And that's basically where the Knights Templar originated. And they, because of prophecies in Daniel and Isaiah, said that there was 1,000 years and they were supposed to go back. So basically 1,000 years, the Knights Templar went back to Jerusalem and went down into the caves there, brought up some stuff and brought it back. And then out of the Knights Templar and through the stonemasons, okay, came the Masons. Mithraism was a religion that was mostly traveled by the Roman soldiers and one that they used, and it had secrets and different things like that. But generally, Masons come more from the Knights Templar.
Thank you. Paul, did I interrupt you inconveniently in the middle of that?
Well, the fact is that it's a syncretion, and I think that's the word that you have to use in terms of where these rituals came from. Williamson represents he talks about the higher levels of the rituals, the fact that the mixture when they got to Britain with the ancient Celtic rituals that were done in Ireland. Ireland, and you got to think of Ireland and Britain as kind of the same thing. The families were mixed. The Dalriada in Scotland were Irish families. I mean, you've got this whole mix of ideas, and it's a syncretion of ideas. So every invasion, Britain was invaded on numerous occasions. He gives a very elaborate. I took it out. The piece was just going to be too long.
Yeah, but we're adding back things for the presentation.
We'll be adding back some of the things.
So now it's time for accretion. Okay.
Exactly.
Before I ask our panelists for final thoughts, I'll swing it to Alanna. You've got your hand up, and allow you to indulge your final thoughts. Also, we are in our dwindling minutes here.
Can you see the book? Is this flashing back and forth?
Yes, Most
Can you see
Dangerous
it?
by S.K. Bain.
Yes.
Yeah. See the coin, the Kennedy coin?
Yes.
That's 2013.
That's-
So forward by Chris Milligan, our publisher, TrineDay. I just got this from TrineDay. And I got another one, The Most Dangerous Book in the World. These are great books, Chris. You're doing amazing with TrineDay. And of course, Paul and Liz's books are published with TrineDay. And so I'm just saying to my friends here, look up TrineDay and buy some books. They didn't tell me to say this. I just came up with the idea because I just got the books and they're great. They're wonderful.
We're gonna get the Pope
So,
on the line. and
wow,
Get him to
get
make
the
Chris a
books.
saint.
Well, thank you. We tried.
And let's see, and in this one, the third part is the golden jubilee of the killing of the king. Just what Paul and Liz have been telling us about today.
Yep. Yep. It was
A
a
lot-
psychological hit against American people,
Mhm.
among other things.
Sure was.
Thank you. Thank you, Alanna. And now Paul and Liz, and finally, Chris. Your final thoughts, summary, benediction.
Well, I guess, I just want everyone to remember that we are all dealing with a practical way to bring this alive. And I think Alanna was the one who really started with it. We have our Equinox Earth Day event coming next March,
In Wendell, yeah.
right? No, but I'm talking about,
Oh,
right,
yes, of
yeah,
course.
right. But, and so we really do, when Alanna read you the mission, I hope everyone can we'll get a copy to everyone. All we're looking for is people to start spreading the word. There are other things you can do. There's a whole bunch of things that we did send to people in an email. And I think what we'll do, Alanna, is we'll send the mission statement out and all the other things and get everyone to begin to look at this as an opportunity to start spreading this word, because it really is connected to what we're going to be delivering in Dallas, which is what you heard. Basically, what I'd say is a very solid preview. It's a very solid preview of it. It's not total, but it's a pretty good moving along.
And Chris, it's your turn for your last word. No rush. I'm curious about that Robert Kennedy speech.
That speech, like I said, was delivered exactly 2 years before his death. And he ended it with a quote from another one of my favorite Kennedy speeches, his inaugural address. And he ended it with, "The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world. With a good conscience, our only sure reward, with history, the final judge of our deeds, let us go forth and lead the land we love, asking his blessings and his help, but knowing that here on earth, God's work must truly be our own."
Mhm.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you for
Thank
joining
you.
our table of discussion. Onwards to a better future.